there's so many rules and regulations regarding how you can treat your employees, monitor your employees, the rules and regulations you can put on them. And then cybersecurity brings about all these new issues that employers need to face when how do they protect their business and still comply with the various different employment laws. And I think this upcoming trend of AI, how the use of AI, it's a really big blend of like how do you manage employees along with protect the cybersecurity of your company. So it's actually two very complementary practice areas that it's exactly really what we're talking about today is like, right, how do you integrate AI into your organization and the effects of on that on your employees? What do you have to tell your employees? What do you have to do with them? So I'm excited to be here.
Yes. Oh, no, this is great because I mean, it's not just like I have a business, in New York, and I'm like, it's hard enough running a business in New York with all the policies and procedures I
Right.
need to have in place as it is. And it's like this is another thing, and I want to make sure I'm doing at least the minimum, best practices as a company, so that, you know, if we get hacked, if something happens, we could do the best we can. We're going to get hacked. It's about mitigating it, and so on, but at a minimum, what do I need to have in place, from your standpoint? Like, when does it open up from a legality standpoint? I have client information, I have PII, I have, and then I have, am I going to take my client information and throw it into ChatGPT and have it out on
Right.
in the AI space and, deep learning engine now on this has it, where's that going to manifest itself someday?
Right.
So,
It's a
mhm,
really interesting issue. So AI itself we don't have a lot of regulations in New York or even federally yet on how we have to treat AI in the workplace or how companies can use AI, but we can take a lot of old legal principles and apply them to the world of cybersecurity and AI. Right? Every business in New York is now a regulated business when it comes to for cybersecurity. So, you're required to have policies and procedures to be in place. You're required to do vendor due diligence. You're required to train your employees. But when we're really talking about AI, what does that mean? And I think you really hit the nail on the head. There's a big issue. I have a concern with trade secret protection. So most AI engines, when you're using them, you're consenting to the fact that they're going to take any information that's inputted into it and like use it to continue learning and growing and for output for later purposes. So I think it's a very big danger and concern for businesses to allow their employees to input any sort of confidential client information, anything having to do with like, anything that can be really considered a trade secret, whether it be client lists, important manufacturing techniques, important marketing techniques, because you're really exposing that then to a third party. And that's one of the biggest ways for a trade secret to be seen no longer as a trade secret, right? You didn't take the steps you needed to protect that. And in fact, you openly and willingly gave it to a universe to use as a part of its, learning
mhm.
protocols. So I think
Oh,
it's
that's
very important if you're going to use any sort of AI in the workplace, there's very strict policies and procedures about what can be input into those systems and what cannot to sort of protect yourselves from any sort of lawsuits down the long run that, things that you claim are confidential, in fact, are not.
so employee training is extremely important then to make
Yeah.
sure that they understand what they should and should not do, especially in this advent of like ChatGPT. Now with Copilot with Microsoft, they
Right.
have said that it is somewhat in a walled garden of sense of like your data doesn't go outside, but unless you have like Copilot Studio and so on, that where you can adjust those settings, and do we really want to trust that? Do we really
Right.
want to trust Microsoft? In keeping saying no, no, trust us. It's not going out back out to our deep learning engine at this point. So as far as that goes, it's like training. My whole philosophy is when unsure, don't put it out. Make sure you have clear training and processes in place for employees. Again, employees are your biggest weakness. 98% of your breaches occur because of untrained employees. So like what you're saying about training them is so important. Okay, I'm going to jump to the next thing here is about we're talking about is employee training, and again how important this is and raising awareness to the employees. Do you recommend like regular automated training, regular training? What do you? Because I know with schools they were like circumventing it with, well, at the next faculty meeting we'll have a training on this and so on, and then a
Right.
whole year go by. Meanwhile, they hired 10 employees and fired five. You know, so what are your feelings on that? Automated training recommended?
Yeah, I think, well, let's just start with cybersecurity, right? From a cybersecurity perspective, you should be at least having an annual training on the topic, But you should also like think about having software that does pretty regular phishing education and testing on your employees, so you can identify if additional source of trainings may be needed for maybe even just a particular subset of employees. So there's these really great platforms you can work with that will send basically routine test phishing emails. So emails that are impersonating people, whether it be the CEO of the company, whether it be UPS, Target, anything like that. So your employees can start to get used to like what are they supposed to be looking for, and it keeps them hyper vigilant, right? Because every single email that they receive, if they think they could possibly be a test from their company, they're going to start reviewing them much more carefully than they would have otherwise. And phishing is still one of the biggest ways that companies can be breached because of. It's one of probably the top ways I see working when I work as breach counsel, is that more often than not, threat actors get into an environment through a phishing email. And the reason is because it's a lot easier for them than sitting around and trying to brute force their way into someone's systems. So regular training is very important regarding cybersecurity. But I think now we really need to, one, educate employees not only on the use of AI, but the impact of AI on cybersecurity, right? It's not only, those of us working day to day, using AI as almost like a shortcut, right? To try to make things easier in the workplace. Threat actors are doing the same thing, right? So we're seeing the use of AI, not only in the workplace, but by threat actors to try to gain access to workplaces. And it's allowing them to be much more creative, come up with much faster and easier code, and try to circumvent the sort of protections you may have in place in your workplace. So it's very important to train your employees not only on what's an appropriate use of AI in the workplace, but then make them aware for sort of flags or triggers that they should be aware of AI possibly being used by threat actors to try to access their system. So there's a lot of different types of trainings. And I know it's a lot for employers because then they're like, well, when are they going to be working if I'm constantly training them? But the problem is, we really do see that a little bit of prevention on the forefront really can save you a lot of pain and aggravation on the back. So I know it's difficult. It's hard to make these sort of trainings a part of the culture of a business, but by doing that, you're really going to save yourselves a lot of headaches in the long run.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I see that because I mean, with AI, like you're saying, is that it can basically even the phishing attempts can be much more sophisticated. And like you said, they have ways now looking to circumvent protections you have in place.
Right.
Yeah, and I also know like we've been pushing out like even DMARC protection and so on because bad actors are replicating your domain name and sending it on behalf, and it's actually coming in as your domain. And in order, if you have to have make sure your email security is set up properly, so those kind of messages will go into your junk instead of being right into your inbox from the CEO, let's say. It's a very crazy world in that sense. The other part of it too is that you have the training for the employees and so on, and from a legal cybersecurity insurance end of it, like how important is MFA? It's like you need MFA, but I hear that, well, I have it, but it's kind of hard, I don't want to do it, and you have 3 or 4 people that refuse to do it. And then what happens if that one of those come in, you now are compromising the entire business, and it might also negate your cyber insurance if it comes in
Right.
that way. So at a minimum, like, from a legal standpoint, and even from the public standpoint, 'cause especially with a school, you have, parents that are saying that my kid's information was stolen, it's out on the web now. It's not a good thing.
Yeah, multi-factor authentication is a great cybersecurity tool. For those who don't know what it is, it's this idea that it's some second level of authentication to confirm that the person who's logging into something is in fact the person who's supposed to be. So it's either like a text message to your cell phone, which is very common, which is probably the least effective form of MFA. And then there's other token applications or websites that you could use. But the idea is that a threat actor should not be able to get that token generally, so they wouldn't be able to gain access without it. I can tell you that the New York Attorney General's office is absolutely looking when there's an investigation into a breach, whether MFA was in place. And if it wasn't, it's something that they're going to find as a deficit in your cybersecurity program and possibly issue fines against you because of it. From an insurance perspective, almost every insurance policy application I see now has a question on, do you have multi-factor authentication in place? And unfortunately, sometimes people don't really understand what that means, or they don't really understand the breadth of the question, right? So sometimes, okay, well, I might have it on logging into my email, but I don't have multi-factor authentication, on people who have access to our servers or who have domain accounts or anything like that. So they check yes, when really the answer might be, something other than yes. Yes, but yes, in these instances, but they're not making those sort of appropriate clarifications on their applications. So what ends up happening is when a breach happens, because it's not really an if, it's a when sort of situation for businesses with breaches. The first thing insurance carriers look into in deciding whether or not they're just going to disclaim coverage is they look at the application and they see, what did they attest to regarding multi-factor authentication? And do we think if multi-factor authentication was in place, this breach would have been preventable? So I have seen carriers move to disclaim coverage because of multi-factor authentication, or send a pretty severe reservation of rights letter, like pending the investigation. They may not pay for the any sort of legal fees or forensic fees, PR fees that may result pending the investigation. So one of the biggest things you can do, one, is have multi-factor authentication in place, but two, understand how it's in place, where it's working, where you don't have it, and be very careful in any sort of cybersecurity insurance applications you're doing, because you can get insurance without having multi-factor authentication in place. You'll pay a lot more than if you did, but any sort of increase in premium is worth it if you're actually going to get coverage at the end of the day. Any sort of not 100% honest statements in your application, whether purposeful or not purposeful, truly an accident, really can lead to you paying all this money in premiums and then getting absolutely no coverage when the time the breach comes.
That's a really good point, in the sense of that. Yeah, but again, I know the premiums are much larger. Most companies won't even cover you if you don't have multi-factor. And you said the breadth of it. A client will come back and say they didn't have their website protected with MFA, and they had 15 different people accessing it. I said, that's going to, you have to make sure that everything is covered. Very important. Another thing that happens is that, I'm running a company and I deal with a lot of third parties. I have software I use, web-based software, and there's some client information up there. How do I know how they're using it? Like, again, like the vendor that I'm giving my information to, it could be a healthcare provider. How do I know what they're doing? I'm assuming they need to have some kind of policies in place that are at least public facing, so I see how my data is going to be handled. But what are the regulations and so on regarding third party vendors?
Yeah, and New York requires it as part of the New York State Shield Act that, New York businesses do vendor due diligence. Like, are you giving a questionnaire to a vendor that you work with, whether it be a new vendor or a continuing vendor, on a yearly basis, to ask what sort of policies and procedures do they have in place, to ask them, how are they dealing with cybersecurity. And I think now it's really important to add AI to that questionnaire, right? What sort of AI are you using in your business? Are you inputting our data into that AI? How are you protecting our information? So vendor due diligence is not a one-time thing. You don't do it the first time you sign a contract with them and never think about it again. It's really something you should be doing on an annual basis with anyone you share personally identifiable information with, or who has access to your systems. And I think it's really important that if you haven't looked at your vendor questionnaire in a few years, to really consider, do we need to start adding questions regarding AI to our vendor due diligence?
Mm-hmm. And from a legal standpoint, if a third party vendor gets hacked and that information gets out there, what is my liability as I'm using a third party software? It could be QuickBooks Online, whatever. If that gets compromised, what is my, again, if I have these policies and I ask those questions and they said they're protected, but that still happens, what is my exposure?
Right. So you're liable, a business is liable for its data no matter where it goes. So if you use some sort of HR software, let's say, and you have all your employee information in there, if a breach at that software occurs, it's still considered your breach for you to manage, handle, and make notifications to. Now, there's ways to reduce risk through contractual obligations. You can have it so that you have certain rights to investigate a breach that happens at the third party. You have rights to access the forensic report that's done. You can put cost shifting indemnification procedures in place that, if a breach occurs and it's your liability to report that breach based upon the facts and circumstances, that they'll pay for the costs, or at least you're named as an additional insured on their cybersecurity insurance policy, so that will cover your costs. But that's contractual in nature. That goes back to having really great, corporate attorneys that you work with who can review your policies and procedures regarding contracting, to review your contracts and make sure that cybersecurity is a key part of that. We have a very large cybersecurity team here, and our head of our cybersecurity group actually is a corporate attorney, and that's things he does all the time, right? He's reviewing these contracts to ensure our clients are protected in case a breach happens, or even if a breach doesn't happen, some other type of instance, that our clients are protected in those sorts of situations. But I can't tell you how many breaches I've worked where, third-party contracts were completely silent regarding liability, costs, indemnification, what sort of, access a client has, and they're stuck making a notification with very little information, and, with deciding, are they then going to sue the third party to sort of recoup costs because they don't have any clear contractual rights to do so. So doing the work beforehand, definitely, and spending the money on a really good contract is definitely worthwhile in the long run.
That's great, because I mean, just from my own business alone, I would love that all to be looked at. Especially because I have a lot of third-party agreements in place, and there's in some cases we do have external, these are huge companies, even like a Microsoft, all right, that they have their policies in place and so on. But the thing is, I mean, what happens with a large company like that, and there's a problem on their end, or Google lost data and so on. It's even with that, those kind of companies don't really want to negotiate with a small guy
Right.
like me. What do I do in that case?
Right. Well, there's always different negotiating power, right? The Googles, the Amazons, the Microsofts of the world, they're typically not going to negotiate their standard agreements. However, if you're using a local HR company, a local accounting company, any sort of, not Google, Microsofts of the world, there usually is flexibility to negotiate those types of provisions. But if you're in a situation where you can't negotiate, then it's on you to build on additional security when you're dealing with them. So ensure that when you're sending them information, you're sending it through encrypted methods, ensuring that, they're storing your information in a way that's workable for you. When we're talking about cloud hosting, right? It's your job to build security onto that cloud, right? You can't just be like, oh, well, I'm in the cloud and we're good today, right? No, you have to, it's your job to build the security on top of the cloud to protect yourself. So there's, even in situations where you're dealing with a contract that may not be negotiable, there's always additional steps you can take on your own to protect yourself.
Hmm. And I'm assuming too, the best practices, or like the best things I could do for that, like that cloud server, for example, there's certain walls I need to put up, for example, if I don't have multi-factor on that,
Right.
or if I'm not using, like, even beyond that, there's like we use tokens and so on to go in, and then even beyond that, we'll use gateways. There's different levels of security you can put in there, and like it's somewhere, it gets very expensive very quickly. So at what point do we like say, well, you did good enough? And we're covered. Is it, MFA is one level, but at what level, like, we're going to be, probably the forensics is going to bring out, well, you could have done more. Yeah, we could have, but that would have been another 100,000 a year.
I think that's a great point. And I think there's always a level of reasonableness that goes into this. And when, I think you really have to look at what kind of data do I have, right? I think a healthcare company is going to be looked at very differently than like maybe as some type of business that only has personally identifiable information, maybe on its own employees, but not other third parties. So I think step one is to assess what data do I have. Step two is to assess then, well, what's the risk to that data? Do I have third parties accessing that data? Do I share it with others? And from there, create a plan. So, if you're looking at, well, we only have data on maybe, let's say, 500 individuals. Well, maybe there's a way to put that personally identifiable information either in a segmented network or some other type of area that you could add special protection onto that, right? And then assess what would be appropriate for the rest of your environment. So there's really great cybersecurity technicians that exist that can really look at what's your data, what's your risk, and can work with you to create a plan. But more often than not, I find that breaches happen due to the low-hanging fruit, right? There wasn't phishing testing done. Their employees weren't aware of what's maybe a bad email, what's a good email, and they opened an attachment or downloaded something that allowed threat actors to get in. And a lot of times, no matter how much fancy software you put on top of that, there's no way to really prevent that type of thing. So I always say it's really look at what you have, assess what would be appropriate, and then move towards a good plan. But don't think, well, I assessed my cybersecurity 6 years ago, so I'm set. You're not. You really, this is something you have to be looking at on an annual basis.
At least an annual basis. Okay. Understood. Yeah, this is great information. I want to thank you, Nicole. This was very enlightening, even for me. I mean, again, I'm always willing to learn new things, but as far as AI in this era with cybersecurity and with phishing attempts, and it's a crazy world we're in right now, and it's so important to have somebody like you that we can lean on and ask these type of questions. And you're an expert in this, and because basically we're not. So I appreciate your time.